Establishing central control. This opening thrust immediately begins building a foothold for piece development and future attacking opportunities. Developing the knight toward the center immediately challenges white's central control and prepares for rapid piece activity across the board. Asserting central dominance, c4 boldly contests space and opens avenues for queenside expansion, posing immediate strategic questions for black's development. Preparing for Kings-Indian fianchetto, aiming for long-term pressure on the queenside through bishop development. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies the d4 pawn and prepares kingside castling, aiming for central control and a harmonious piece setup. Developing the bishop to its longest diagonal significantly bolsters black's kingside influence and prepares for potential pawn breaks in the center. Establishing central control and preparing for pawn advances across the board, aiming to dominate space. Establishing a central pawn presence and preparing for kingside development, this move solidifies black's positional grip. Solidifying the center's pawn chain while preparing to castle kingside, this bishop move aims for quiet coordination before initiating central play. Securing the monarch is paramount. This castling initiates a crucial defensive posture for the king. Developing the knight to f3 solidifies the center, prepares for kingside castling, and creates a flexible structure for controlling the kingside flank, potentially targeting weak squares later. Unleashing a central pawn thrust, black challenges white's established pawn structure, aiming to disrupt the otherwise harmonious development and immediately inject dynamism into the game. Safeguarding the king's sanctuary initiates a phase of consolidation, preparing for the inevitable middle game confrontation by reinforcing the central pawn structure and aligning pieces for coordinated action. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies the pawn center and prepares to contest the d4 square, simultaneously unblocking the queen's diagonal and offering a flexible pawn structure that could lead to a fianchetto defense or a more aggressive central push. Fortifying the center with the bishop, white prepares to develop the queen's rook and potentially initiate play on the kingside, subtly restricting black's central pawn ambitions. Strategically repositioning the rook to the e-file opens up long-term attacking possibilities and prepares for a potential pawn push, while also subtly reinforcing the kingside defense. Opening the d-file immediately forces black to make a decision, potentially disrupting their natural pawn structure development and creating an imbalance from the outset. Reclaiming the pawn immediately resolves the tension in the center, simplifying the position and opening lines for your pieces, particularly the rook on the e-file, while also allowing the knight to potentially reposition towards the queenside. Initiating a queen exchange here simplifies the position and aims to transition into an endgame where white might enjoy a slight lead in development and control of central squares, potentially pressuring black's kingside pawns later. Reclaiming the center with the knight, black aims to redistribute forces and challenge white's control after the central pawn exchange and the queen trade. This maneuver prepares for increased activity from the knight, potentially targeting central squares or supporting pawn pushes in the near future. Unleashing a knight to a central outpost, this maneuver creates immediate pressure on black's queenside, aiming to disrupt its pawn structure and control key squares. The knight's detour to the 6th rank, while seemingly defensive, subtly reinforces the pawn chain and prepares for a potential kingside advance, creating a more robust structure against white's centralized pieces. Unleashing a knight towards the kingside, white aims to exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's pieces, particularly the knight on f6, which is now the primary target. This aggressive thrust threatens to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially create weaknesses around the monarch. Returning the rook to the e-file aims to contest this vital central pathway, anticipating potential exchanges or creating opportunities for counterplay. White asserts dominion over the central files, especially the d-file, which is now effectively a highway for the rook, putting pressure on black's potentially vulnerable king. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this maneuver prepares to develop the c8 bishop and contests the important b6 square, preventing white from easily expanding on that wing while also opening lines for potential counterplay. Opening a central pawn race seeks to destabilize black's knight and potentially force a concession for space. Seizing the central outpost after white's pawn thrust creates immediate pressure, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed central pawn chain and challenge control of the d5 square. This decisive maneuver rips open the king's defenses, forcing a critical decision and potentially a significant material imbalance. Faced with an unexpected check on the king, black's bishop retreats, aiming to preserve the structure and prepare for potential counterplay, though this defensive posture concedes vital central space and temporarily hampers piece development in the queenside. Seizing the initiative by snatching the pawn, white boldly ventures into enemy territory, seeking to disrupt black's consolidated position and create immediate threats. Reclaiming the pawn with the rook dramatically alters the pawn structure, immediately confronting the overextended knight and forcing a difficult decision for white regarding the fate of that aggressive piece. Seizing the open file and threatening the a7 pawn with the rook's relocation is a sound pursuit, consolidating pressure on the queenside and aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses that black's pawn structure might present after the recent exchanges. The black king, now exposed on the 7th rank, desperately seeks sanctuary, hoping to escape the relentless pressure the rook exerts along the newly opened file. Solidifying the pawn chain and creating a new defensive bulwark against any potential black incursions on the kingside opens up avenues for white's pieces, particularly the queen and bishop, to reposition and support each other. Black's knight now retreats, a tactical necessity to avoid capture after white's aggressive knight sortie. The immediate pressure on the a7 pawn is relieved, but black must now consider how to reactivate this knight, perhaps aiming for a central outpost like d6 or even c5 if the opportunity arises, while also being mindful of white's control over the d-file and the potential for further kingside pressure. The position is quite open, and both sides need to be extremely careful about piece coordination. Sharpening the pawn structure, white subtly prepares to gain central space and activate the queenside pieces, aiming for a more flexible endgame. Gaining a foothold on the d6 square injects immediate dynamism, threatening to disrupt white's control over the central files and prepare for a counteroffensive involving the rook on e8. The rook's redeployment to the 8th rank aims to penetrate black's defenses, hinting at a potential endgame where white's active pieces could prove decisive. The rook's deep dive into the opponent's territory, aiming for the f8 square, forces black's hand, and h6 emerges as a desperate, yet somewhat necessary, attempt to create a safe haven for the monarch and initiate some counterplay along the kingside. Rerouting the knight towards the kingside, seeking to exploit any lingering weaknesses around black's monarch or to reinforce potential attacks. Strategically, black seeks to consolidate their pieces after the recent exchanges, aiming to untangle the knight from its somewhat passive outpost and prepare for potential central breakthroughs. The knight's relocation to e6 offers more flexibility, potentially supporting d7 or f4 pawn pushes while also guarding against immediate threats on the kingside. It's a nuanced repositioning, prioritizing pawn structure and active piece placement over immediate tactical fireworks. Stealing initiative from the opponent's disorganized position, this rook maneuver aims to disrupt black's pieces by threatening a fork on the d6 knight, forcing a defensive reaction and potentially opening lines for further attack. The rook's retreat to the e8 square, while seemingly defensive, surrenders valuable central space and time, allowing white's pieces to consolidate their advantage and exert further pressure on black's position. The knight exchange, finally, rectifies the pawn structure and simplifies the board, paving the way for a potential king hunt as the queens are already off. The immediate recapture of the knight, while seemingly forced, initiates a complex endgame scenario where black aims to consolidate their slightly less active pieces against white's potentially more coordinated pawn structure. The bishop now asserts influence over the critical light squares, specifically targeting black's kingside weakness and potentially preparing a later advance of the g-pawn, while also keeping an eye on the central action. Repositioning the knight to d6 offers a fresh opportunity for the knight to join the defense, potentially fortifying the kingside if needed, and hinting at a more active role in the upcoming maneuvers. Positioning the bishop to f1 is a prudent decision, aiming to reinforce the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn pushes like b3 or even c6, which could restrict black's knight activity on d6. This maneuver also subtly supports any future advance of the pawn, creating a more solid defensive perimeter for white's king. Furthermore, it clears the d1 square for a rook, anticipating a potential reoccupation of the d-file if black decides to contest it. Asserting presence on the open file, black aims to disrupt white's piece coordination and prepare for potential advances. The knight finds a less crowded square, aiming to regroup and potentially support a kingside advance or reroute towards the center, seeking out any positional weaknesses that may have arisen from the recent exchanges and offering a different angle of attack. Reinvigorating the queenside's potential, the bishop targets the white pawn chain's base on c5, aiming to disrupt the enemy's structural integrity and potentially open lines for counterplay. Securing the queenside pawn majority is the immediate priority, though it concedes an isolated doubled pawn to black's structure. A bold recapturing maneuver, aiming to disrupt white's knight outpost and regain a crucial pawn on the queenside, although it does open lines for white's remaining pieces to exploit. Pivoting the rook to the open d-file asserts control and prepares for potential pawn pushes or attacks on black's queenside. Unlocking the queenside pawn chain now creates immediate threats to white's centralized knight and offers black some much-needed breathing room. Reinforcing the central pawn majority and preparing to advance it, this move aims to restrict black's pieces and create a passed pawn. A bold repositioning, aiming to awaken black's inactive pieces from their dormant squares and establish a more dynamic presence along the central files. This advance aims to stake a claim on the kingside, preparing to potentially support a pawn push that could restrict black's knight and gain breathing room for white's pieces. Shifting the monarch towards the center offers the king greater mobility and access to potential defensive outposts. Solidifying the outpost on the fourth rank, the bishop now eyes potential weaknesses in black's somewhat cramped kingside structure, aiming to disrupt any immediate plans of pawn breaks or piece activity from that side. Re-establishing central control and preparing to challenge the open d-file offers a dynamic solution to the current standoff. Re-establishing pressure on the d-file aims to disrupt black's now somewhat disorganized pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the king. Introducing the knight to d4 aims to destabilize white's center and create dynamic counterplay, seeking to exploit any potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure. Shifting the monarch towards the kingside now offers improved safety and frees up the rooks to coordinate their offensive potential. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside now aims to disrupt white's central control and create immediate complications, potentially opening lines for black's rook or bishop to exploit the newly created weaknesses, especially if white's king remains exposed. Securing the queenside pawn majority now becomes paramount, potentially opening lines for rook activity or even a future pawn push to dislodge black's centralized knight and create a passed pawn. Doubling down on the central pawn push, black seeks to destabilize white's queenside and create avenues for their own pieces, a bold attempt to inject dynamism into a position that has been slowly grinding forward. Unleashing the bishop to g8 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses around the king and opening lines for future aggression, though it does allow black to solidify their central foothold. Seizing the open file for the rook, this advance injects immediate dynamism into the center, challenging the pawn structure and creating tactical possibilities for black's pieces. Reclaiming the central pawn advances white's initiative, but relinquishes a key defensive piece from the kingside. Seeking to stabilize the pawn structure and prepare for a potential regrouping of forces. The opening lines suggest an intention to consolidate black's position, perhaps aiming to create a more robust defensive setup. After a series of exchanges, the pieces are fewer, and the remaining pawns become more significant. This particular move might be a preparatory step, allowing the other knights to find better squares or to reinforce central control. Considering the recent pawn pushes, vigilance is needed to ensure no weaknesses are created, and that the king remains sufficiently protected as the game progresses. The dynamic on the board is shifting, and the subtle repositioning of pieces now could pave the way for future tactical opportunities or a more solid endgame. Redirecting the rook to the d-file aims to create renewed pressure on black's central pawns, particularly the d6 square, and potentially to eye the king if black isn't careful with their defensive setup. A surprising retreat, repositioning the rook to a less active square, seemingly conceding the file and potentially inviting white's king to become more involved in the center. The rook on c3 now aims to support a potential advance on the queen side, potentially eyeing the weak b5 pawn and aiming to create passed pawns. Unleashing this pawn storm on the queen side creates immediate friction and challenges white's pawn structure, forcing a positional reckoning rather than allowing for passive development. Unleashing the kingside pawns now aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and create attacking opportunities, though it also potentially weakens white's own monarch. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, black aims to disrupt white's spatial advantage and create counterplay on the queen side, potentially opening lines for future piece activity. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice to disrupt black's central control, opening lines for potential threats against the exposed king. The pawn structure is irrevocably fractured by this capture, opening the g-file and presenting a new avenue of attack for your opponent's queen, while simultaneously weakening your own king's defenses. Challenging the pawn chain's integrity, the bishop repositions to exert pressure on the king side, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially open lines for attack. Faced with the encroaching pawns and the exposed king, the knight retreats to a more defensive posture, aiming to bolster the weakening queenside defenses and potentially counterattack on the central files. Opening the g-file offers immediate tactical opportunities, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create mating threats against the king. Accepting this knight exchange relinquishes black's last active piece, paving the way for white's doubled pawns on the g-file to become a serious attacking asset. Initiating a decisive pawn chain push, this pawn advance aims to rupture black's defensive structure and exploit the exposed king. Initiating a crucial counterattack on the king side, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and exploit the open files. The king seeks refuge behind its pawns, a defensive posture becoming increasingly precarious as the queens have left the board. Activating the knight towards white's kingside presents a dynamic counterplay, aiming to disrupt the established pawn structure and potentially create attacking opportunities. Unleashing the rook's latent power, this maneuver aims to exploit the open h-file and potentially disrupt black's king's safety, introducing immediate tactical possibilities that demand black's keen attention. Unleashing a king's assault, this counterattack opens vital lines against the exposed monarch, forcing white to react defensively and potentially disrupting any coordinated attacking efforts. Pivoting the monarch to a more active square, this repositioning aims to escape the immediate threats and prepare for potential pawn pushes or piece reorganizations in the coming exchanges. Unleashing a disruptive check, the knight injects immediate chaos into white's seemingly secure central pawn structure, forcing a crucial decision and potentially unraveling the coordination of black's attacking pieces. The king's desperate scramble for safety now takes center stage, as moving it to e3 actively seeks to unblock the central pawns and potentially coordinate them for a later push, even if it means venturing into slightly more exposed territory. The dragon's breath is unleashed as the rook slides into the 7th rank, eyeing that vulnerable king and preparing to cascade pressure down the open files. Securing the king's escape route while simultaneously preparing to regroup the beleaguered rook offers a glimmer of hope in this otherwise precarious position. The king's journey across the board, seeking a safer haven, now enters a critical phase as it attempts to evade further pressure and find support amongst its own pawns. Unleashing the knight to harass the enemy monarch, forcing a crucial decision about its safety. The king's bold dash into the center, though seemingly audacious, might be the only chance to avoid being completely overwhelmed by white's encroaching pieces. A well-timed knight check disrupts black's king's safety, forcing a response that will likely loosen the pawn's structure further. The king, now exposed, desperately seeks shelter, but the opponent's pieces are converging with menacing intent. Bringing the rook to the first rank now prepares to challenge control of the central files, aiming to disrupt black's knight coordination and potentially exploit weaknesses in the pawn's structure. Unleashing the rook to the second rank creates immediate pressure on white's king, disrupting its safety and forcing defensive measures. Opening lines for your king immediately feels like a desperate gamble, but the goal is to disrupt black's menacing knight and create a pawn majority down the queenside. Exploiting white's exposed king, this forcing check aims to disrupt the enemy's already compromised defensive structure and potentially gain material or create critical weaknesses. The king's sudden relocation to the wing opens up aggressive possibilities, potentially forcing a draw through perpetual check if black isn't careful about coordinating their rooks. The knight's journey to b3 aims to disrupt white's queen's pawn structure and potentially establish a strong outpost. White's king is seeking the relative safety of the kingside, aiming to escape the immediate pressure and potentially participate in the upcoming endgame skirmishes. The knights hop into obscurity sacrifices material for a fleeting positional disruption, leaving black's king exposed to a potential mating net while white meticulously rebuilds. King hunts often lead to surprising turns. This capture secures the opposition and prepares to re-centralize your monarch. Opening up the b-file with the pawn push forces the white knight to a decision point, potentially creating a pathway for the rook to become active or to draw attention away from the central pawn structure. Snatching the pawn on a4 solidifies white's material advantage, but it comes at the cost of leaving the knight exposed and potentially diverting it from more critical defensive or offensive duties. Harnessing the open file to disrupt white's pawn structure, black aims to exploit the exposed knight. Unleashing the pawn chain to seize more territory and restrict black's knights feels like a strategic imperative now. The advance of the c-pawn opens a direct avenue for the black king to potentially become entangled in the pawn storm brewing on the queenside, opening the path for the rook to become a potent attacking piece again. The pawn's advance here fundamentally reshapes the board's dynamics, creating a potent passed pawn that demands immediate attention and significantly alters the defensive calculus for white's king. The king is cornered. This check forces a response that unravels black's defenses in the center. The king, now exposed by the pawn advance, finds itself in the crosshairs of a discovered attack, forcing a desperate repositioning. Squeezing the knight to the edge of the board restricts its influence and prepares to exploit the open files. The black king finally finds a breathing space, escaping the relentless pressure and preparing to participate in the pawn race. The king bravely steps into the fray, seeking refuge near the central action and preparing to support the advance of the pawn. The black king, finally venturing out from its defensive shell, now faces a crucial decision. Does it aim to support its isolated pawn or immediately seek safety? This adventurous foray, while active, leaves it exposed to potential checks and skirmishes along the central files.